Let me encourage you to go to Ephesians chapter 6, and we are at verse 17. We are continuing our series called Frequently Asked Questions, and as you know, we've been going through piece by piece the armor of God, and today we're going to talk about the helmet of salvation. Now, I must say this about this sermon, right? It is going to feel a little different than our normal sermons, right? It's going to feel a little bit more technical, and it's going to require probably a little bit more focus because there's a lot of stuff that's going to be coming your way. And normally what we do, we like to preach and just hit one nail all the time. Just give one nail and just keep hitting that over and over. But to get to that nail, we're going to kind of talk about a ton of different stuff. So I pray that there will be great focus here this morning and that we would all go there. So Ephesians 6:17, and as I said, we're going to look at another piece of the armor today, and it's called the helmet of salvation. And we're going to move around a little bit also in terms of the passages. So we are going to look at some other passages. So I hope your fingers are really quick there. So this is what Ephesians 6:17, and we're just going to do the first part. It says this: take the helmet of salvation. All right? Take the helmet of salvation. And that's our big piece here this morning. Take the helmet of salvation. And because we have a lot to cover in a short time, let me just jump straight into it, right? But first, let's do a recap. So, the first piece of God's armor that we are to take up is the belt of truth. What does that mean? It means that we are to be committed to the truth about God and what He has said and done. Next piece we talked about was the breastplate of righteousness, which means by faith in Jesus Christ, we have been made right to stand before God with the mandate to live out our righteousness socially and relationally. The other defense we have against the wiles and schemes of the enemy is the gospel of peace. And Paul likened that to the shoes that we wear. And the gospel of peace is the good news that we are at peace with God. He fights for us. And not only that, we have the peace of God in our lives, which in turn makes us ready to do whatever God says to do. So with truth, righteousness, peace, and readiness in hand, the next thing we talked about is faith that acts like a shield. Faith that protects us from the enemy's fiery arrows of temptation. So truth, righteousness, peace, readiness, and faith. All of these are needed in our battle against the enemy of our soul. But there's another critical virtue that we need in our spiritual conflict. And that is what Paul is going to share with us here today. So if you write notes, please write this down. The helmet, so we're on to the helmet, right? And we just read that the helmet of salvation. The helmet is actually hope in our salvation. The helmet is hope in our salvation. Now, how did we get there? How did we get the idea that the helmet of salvation is talking about hope, and more specifically, hope in our salvation, which was achieved for us by Jesus Christ? How did we get there? So, let's look at 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 1. So if you can, please turn there. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 1. It's going to be on the screen, and I'm going to emphasize certain points, but I'm going to start reading it. You can note it, and of course, you can always read it later. Now, this is Paul talking. Now, concerning the times and the seasons, brothers, you have no need to have anything written to you. For you yourselves are fully aware that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. While people are saying there's peace and security, then sudden destruction will come upon them as labor pains come upon a pregnant woman, and they will not escape. Verse 4. But you are not in darkness, brothers, for that day to surprise you like a thief. For you are all children of light, children of the day. We are not of the night or of the darkness. So then let us not sleep as others do, but let us keep awake and be sober. Verse 7. For those who sleep, sleep at night, and those who get drunk are drunk at night. But since we belong to the day, let us be sober, having put on the breastplate of faith and love, and for a helmet, the hope of salvation. For God has not destined us for wrath, but to obtain salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ. So let's... Oh, okay. Was it just me hearing the Spirit talking there, or did anybody else hear that? Okay. So it's not just me. All right, so let's unpack this text a little bit, right? The day of the Lord. The day of the Lord, theologians have said, speaks to a future day when God will return and decisively intervene in human history, bringing it to a close. Some have said that there are two important days, today and that day. There will come a day where there will be no more tomorrows. We look forward to tomorrow, but there will come a day where that would be the end of human history. And that is what Paul is describing here as the day of the Lord. But the day of the Lord also speaks to any time that the Lord intervenes in the affairs of men to achieve his plan. No, since God could intervene in both human history and he could intervene in our lives at any time, Paul is saying we should regularly exercise the virtues of faith, love, and hope. So note this, all right? First letter that Paul wrote, and as you know, we've been talking about Paul in our Acts series. He got saved. He was a persecutor of the church. He got saved. He went all over the known world and he was preaching the gospel. And through the grace of God, he was able to set up a number of churches in different places. So the first letter, the first epistle that Paul wrote in AD 52, if you're keeping record, it's disputable by some, but the first letter he wrote was to the Thessalonians, a group of believers, much like us, in a city called Thessalonica. In it, Paul began by laying the groundwork for what he believed was the three fundamental Christian virtues: faith, hope, and love. Remember, that's his first letter. So he's laying the groundwork. Now, the virtues of faith, love, and hope, he linked them to pieces of a Roman soldier's armor. Faith and love was likened to a breastplate. Hope was likened to a helmet. However, later, 5 years later or so, he wrote a letter to a group of Christians in a place named Corinth. And in that letter, he said this, in 1 Corinthians 13:13, he said this: faith, hope, and love abide. In other words, faith, hope, and love are not only the foundation graces of the Christian faith, but they're also the abiding graces of the Christian faith. A bit later, he wrote another letter to a group of Christians meeting in a city called Rome. Rome was the world's capital at that time, so to speak. And in that letter, he connected faith to righteousness, declaring that we are declared righteous before God through and by faith in Jesus Christ, apart from any works of the law. So in that letter to the Romans, Paul says, faith is the means by which we were saved by God. Faith was a gift that was given to us. We placed our faith in Jesus Christ, and God said, I'm going to credit that to your account as righteousness. To divert a little bit, James, the brother of Jesus, he wrote a letter to a bunch of Christians, especially Jewish Christians all over the world. And in it, he said, faith apart from works is dead. We said this last week. These two men were not giving different definitions of faith, but instead they were showing what faith looks like from different vantage points. It was as if one stood up on one hill and he looked this way, and another stood up on that same hill and he looked that way. So one said, wow, it's lovely and green, and the other one said, wow, it's lovely, but it has lots of water. It's the same thing they were seeing. For Paul, Faith in Jesus Christ is the means of salvation. For James, the outcome of being made right by faith is works of faith. And we talked about that a few weeks ago, that as believers, we need to be socially righteous, fixing what is wrong around us, and we need to be relationally righteous, fixing our wrong relationships. Now, still later, about 10 years after writing to the Thessalonians, Paul wrote a letter to the Ephesians. And in this letter, he developed his Roman soldier imagery. So, the belt was truth, the shoes was peace and readiness, but now the breastplate was righteousness. It wasn't faith and love, it was righteousness. Now, did Paul forget what he had written 10 years before? How many of us remember some stuff that we have written 10 years in the past? For some of us now, if you go to apply for a job, your social media account will be checked to make sure that you didn't do something crazy 10 years ago. Right? But did Paul forget what he wrote? The answer is no. Because in Paul's theology, and he cited Abraham as an example in Romans 4:3, faith is counted as righteousness. So when Abraham believed in the promises of God, God counted that belief as righteousness. So Paul did not depart from what he wrote 10 years earlier, he merely expanded upon it. So to the Thessalonians he said, put on faith and love like a breastplate. To the Ephesians he says, put on righteousness as a breastplate. But he's saying the same thing. What he's saying is that to be righteous, one must have faith. One must have faith. And of course, love, as we know in 1 Corinthians 13:13, in Paul's mind is the greatest virtue. Love is the greatest virtue. It's the fundamental virtue, which is not surprising because Paul, as a Jew, would have grown up learning Deuteronomy 6:4, which commanded all Jews to love the Lord thy God with all thy soul, all thy heart, and all thy mind. Jesus, when he came onto the scene, he took that command and he made it the foundational command for all other commands. And he said, listen, all the commands rest on these two. Love God, love others. That's it. If you can do those two, you've got it. Love God, love others. No more, no less. Love God, love others, and you've gotten it. So, when Paul said to the Thessalonians that they should take hope and put it on like a helmet, and to the Ephesians that they should take salvation and put it on as a helmet, did he make a mistake? Again, I say no. Just as faith is necessary for righteousness, get this, loved ones, hope is critical for salvation. Hope is critical for salvation, whether it is present salvation or future salvation. And we'll say more about that later. Now here's the thing, right? We did not have hope prior to being saved. We were enemies of God. God gifted us faith. We believed the truth about Jesus Christ. Righteousness became ours, and then hope started to bubble up. So we did not have hope prior to being saved. But now that we are saved, hope then comes with that. So the helmet of salvation is interpreted as the helmet of hope in salvation. The helmet of hope in salvation. So, it took a long while just to say the helmet of salvation is the helmet of hope in salvation. Are you guys with me still? Yeah. Okay, good. All right, now let's define hope. All right, what is hope? Hope is a confident expectation of a sure and desirable future outcome. It's a confident expectation of a sure and desirable future outcome. So in our struggle against the enemy, whether it's the flesh according to Galatians 5, or the world according to 1 John 19, or the devil, we need to always be thinking and expecting that the outcome of what we are experiencing will be greater than what we are currently going through. Hope says, what I am going through now will not last, but it will be swallowed up in the outcome of what I am going through. Now, the Roman soldier would wear a helmet to protect his head from being split open by an enemy's sword. More specifically, according to the commentators, a broadsword that would be used by soldiers mounted on a horse. And you guys have watched movies, right? There's a guy on a horse and he's riding and he has a sword, and as he rides, there are guys on the ground and he's trying to decapitate them. Right. Now, the broadsword was a heavy sword, between 3 and 4 feet in length, and it had a double-edged blade. So, the idea was this: when an opponent tried to split a Roman soldier's skull, the helmet would act in such a way to protect him from that sword by deflecting the sword and preventing the soldier from either getting injured or dying. So by using hope in salvation as a helmet, Paul means to show us that the enemy is after our minds. He's after our minds. How does that relate to us? How does the enemy try to get our thoughts? Among other things, he uses hardships, persecutions, and suffering. Hardships, persecutions, and suffering. Among other things. There are other things he uses. In one of our earlier messages in this series, we said that the enemy is often behind many of our physical hardships. He's often the source of many of our physical hardships. Not all, but many. He's also behind the persecutions, afflictions, and adversities that the Christian finds herself in. The enemy's goal is that through suffering, through adversity, we would stop thinking about God and instead focus on the adversity. We know what happens when we do this. When we get so consumed by what we are going through, we can't think about anything else. All we think about is this, and we have a tunnel vision about this thing. We're not thinking about God's deliverance. We're not thinking about God's ability. All we're thinking about is what is before us. This is what hope says. Many of you know this. Romans 8:18. This is a great verse to memorize. And if you mark your Bible, this is a really good verse to mark it up. This is what hope says. For I consider that the suffering of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. The suffering of the present. And I want to stop, right? Because I'm still thinking of Holly and Art and Jeannie. Would you think that they're suffering now because they've had to bury their mother? I think they are. And I don't know what other persons are going through. It may be a physical malady, it may be emotional strain, it may be loss of a relationship. What Paul is saying, filled with the Holy Spirit in Romans 8:18, is that whatever you're going through now cannot be compared to the future glory that is going to be revealed to you. So if you were to take your present suffering and put it on a scale, and you were to take the future glory of God and put it on a scale, the scale will significantly tilt to this end. Because the future glory far outweighs the present suffering. This hope in future glory is often most evident in persecuted believers around the world. Many of you know this. You will read it on the news that in a number of places, Christians are being killed because of their faith. They're being persecuted because of their faith. They're being chased from their village or their home or their business place because of their faith. Well, what often happens is we see a sort of joyful endurance that define the lives of these persecuted believers. And I know some persons have said, oh, in the West we have relative freedom. Christians could practice their faith alongside all others. We aren't necessarily persecuted for our faith. We don't have to worry about somebody coming through those doors with guns and machetes and killings. We don't have to worry about that. But yet we still struggle with despair, and we still struggle with having a vibrant faith. But what about those Christians who are in parts of the world where they can't meet like this? Why are they so joyful? And I know some people have said, oh, you know what? All the church in the West needs is a dose of persecution. Anybody? Hands up. More persecution? Nope. I don't want it. It may come, but I don't want it. We thank God for the freedom that He gives us. But here's the question. Why aren't we as joyful as our brothers and sisters who are dying for their faith? Right now, today, whether it's in China or North Korea, whether it's in certain parts of Africa, whether it's in the Middle East, why aren't we so joyful? We are well fed. Everybody looks, some a little bit more than others. I'm not looking at you, Donnie. A little bit more helpings. Why aren't we as joyful as they are when we have so much? I've said this before and I'll say it again. Every one of you in here, you're part of the 5%. You're part of the richest 5% of people in the whole world. You drove to come here. You have on nice clothes, expensive perfumes. You had breakfast. Some of you thinking about the lunch at IGA that you're going to eat. 5%. 95% of the world do not have what you have here. But as followers of Christ, why aren't we more joyful? Why do we get turned over by illness, bad news? The reason is our persecuted brothers and sisters around the world are teaching us how to have hope in the future. And somehow we seem to have lost that hope. We tend to think, our best life is now. So I'm going to grab for everything, and I'm going to keep everything, and I'm going to keep my bat and my ball, and this is mine, because I have nothing to look forward to. And then we find that it's a vapor. It's empty. It's empty. But hope is more. Hope also means having a firm and confident expectation of future well-being. Not just of a desirable outcome, but of future well-being. So not only would the outcome of what we are going through now be greater, but our future well-being would be greater than what it is now. Not only does the enemy use suffering and hardships to disable our walk with Christ, he also uses weapons such as despondency, despair, and depression. And we have talked a lot about that, so I won't go in depth. But hope tells us that our future self will be better than our current self. Hope doesn't just tell us, I will get out of this situation. Hope says, my future self, I will be, there isn't a word like this, but I'm just kind of creating this word. I will be weller in the future than I am now. But you all understand, right? Right. So it worked. I will be better. I will have greater well-being in the future. I like what musician, social commentator, Caribbean musical icon and writer, Dr. Leroy Calise from Trinidad. Many of you know him as the Black Stallion. He said in one of his most famous songs, and you know this, better days, finish it, better days are coming. Better days are coming. Hope says, no matter what you're going through now, better days are right around the corner. That is what hope says. Now, in expressing his theology of salvation, Paul connected faith to righteousness. Through faith, we are made righteous. In the same breath, he connects hope to salvation, because he wants to direct our thoughts to this idea. Whatever we are going through now, we'll be saved from it. Whatever we are going to go through in the future, we'll be saved from it. So he's trying to say to us, have hope in your present and future salvation from whatever you are experiencing. Have hope in your present and future blessings. So let's define salvation. We just defined hope. Let's define salvation. If the helmet is hope in salvation, and hope is a clear expectation or confident expectation of the future, what is salvation? Salvation is this. It is deliverance or rescue from danger and into safety. It is deliverance or rescue from danger and into safety. Note the dual definition of salvation. Salvation is about deliverance from something into something. We often think of salvation as merely deliverance from. But throughout the Bible, the term salvation has often been used to describe God rescuing us from the penalty and the power of sin and placing us in his protection and provision. So it's a beautiful word. God rescues us from sin's penalty. God rescues us from sin's power. God rescues us from sin's presence. But God places us in his provision and in his protection. Salvation is like being rescued from prison and then given this luxurious palace to live in. It's always from something to something else. But it's important for our study. If we are to glean and fully appreciate the beauty of hope, it is important for us to understand what hope is and what our salvation is. So this is going to get a little technical, right? So follow along with me. Paul in Romans 4, remember this, Romans was written after 1 Thessalonians, but before Ephesians. Paul in Romans 4 focuses on Abraham as the father of our faith. And he makes the case that all who are saved or who are made righteous through possessing faith in Jesus Christ has Abraham as their faith father. Why? Because Abraham was made righteous because he had faith in God's promise. God said to Abraham, I'll give you a land, I'll give you a son, you'll become the father of many nations. And Abraham had faith in that, and that was accredited to him as righteousness. How did Abraham's faith show itself? Romans 4 goes on to tell us it showed itself by the hope that he possessed. When God said to Abraham, I am going to do this for you. And God spoke of a future blessing, not a present blessing, of a future blessing. Abraham's hope was activated. Faith and hope are necessary components for salvation. We cannot have one without the other. We can't be children of faith without having hope. We can't be a community of faith without having hope that the future would be brighter and better. It's impossible. Abraham shows us it's impossible, and Paul is telling us that Abraham had faith and he had hope. And loved ones, we need to add to our faith hope. Hope. Now there are three components to salvation. Three components to it. There's the past, there's the present, and there's the future. When God saved us, he saved us from every aspect of past, present, and future sin. He saved us from every aspect of sin. The past, the future, and the present. I mixed that up. Past, present, future. So look at it this way. Your past account of sin is wiped clean. So the sins you did in the past have not been brought forward and placed in your current account. When I was doing CXC, I think we call it bookkeeping at the time, principles of accounts. Anybody remember that? Yes. I decided to skip ill-advisedly, because I see some students, I decided to skip my CXC Principles of Accounts exam. Not just the class, I skipped the exam. I decided to stay away. Lord, thank you for saving me. Here's the thing I couldn't get with accounts. If two numbers are not equal, if this account doesn't equal to that account, something is wrong. You have to go and find, if you have X figure in this account, you must have X figure in that account. And no matter what you did, you couldn't find to get that figure over to this figure. I couldn't get it. I couldn't get it. I thought it was the most frustrating thing after Pythagoras' theorem. Seriously. I thought it was the most frustrating thing. I couldn't understand account. But I understand this much about accounts. When Jesus says, I am not going to take your past account of sin and apply it to your current account, I understand this. All the penalty of my sins in the past is not going to be applied to me in the present or the future. So I understand this. There is no present penalty for past sins. If your faith is in Jesus Christ, there is no present penalty for past sin. If that song's too good to be true, it is good news, loved ones. And let me tell you why it's good news. Because I have suffered with this, and I'm sure that some of you have suffered with this. Something starts to happen to you. Something bad is happening to you. And you start thinking, oh boy, all them mangoes I used to thief. From Miss Mackenzie mango tree. God is now punishing me for it. Because we in the Caribbean, right, we grew up with the idea of, for those of you who grew up with a mother and father, you did something wrong, mommy would beat you, and then tell you, when daddy comes home, you're getting another licking. You got mommy licking, but you'll get daddy licking when he comes home. And then some of us grew up in the time where if you did something wrong, any stranger could lick you. And then they would go home. Those wicked people, they would go home and they would tell your parents, Mrs. Lewis, your son did X, Y, Z, and then you get licks again. But hear this, loved ones, that is not how God operates. When God wipes our slate clean, he does not punish us in the present for sins that happened in the past. There may be consequences, but not punishment. Not punishment. But get this, there's also no present penalty for present sins. Consequences, yes. No present penalty for present sins, but it gets better. There's no future penalty for present and future sins. Salvation means you have been completely freed from the penalty of sin. Now, that's penalty as it concerns the power of sin in your life. Power here meaning the pull of sin to get you to obey it. Salvation says you have been freed from that. You've been freed from that. Now, I'm not talking about sinless perfection, but rather the fact that you are being sanctified daily, you're being made perfect daily. Sin is losing its power over your life. Daily sin is losing its power. You're being sanctified by the Spirit of God on a daily basis. That's why your testimony should be, I used to do this last year, but I'm not doing that anymore. Or I used to do 10 of this last year, but now I'm only doing 1 and I don't like it. Our testimony should be one of progressive, not sinless perfection, but progressive perfection. We are getting better as the days go along. The other thing is this, the presence of sin. Sin is still stalking us. Still stalking us. I was going to use an analogy of a boyfriend stalking a girl, but that's dangerous. So I'll skip from that. But sin is still stalking us. But wait, it's not only boys that stalk. Brentford? Don't go there. Okay, let's move on quickly. It's like speaking about a woman's hairpiece, right? You don't go there. Yeah. Okay, so get this. Sin still stalks us, but there's coming a day, the day of the Lord, when the very presence of sin would be removed from our minds. Penalty is gone. The power is going and will go. And a day will come, the day of the Lord, when the presence would go. So let me sum it up. When you were saved from your sins, you were saved from the past, present, and future penalty of sin. You were saved from the present and future power of sin, and you were saved from the future presence of sin. But salvation means more than just being saved from something. It also means being given something. So while God showed us patience in the past, and while God gives us the grace of provision in the present, every present situation you're going through, salvation from God tells us that in the future, God is going to give us grace and glory. Look at what 2 Thessalonians 2:13 says. But we ought always to give thanks to God for you, brothers beloved by the Lord, because God chose you as the first fruits to be saved through sanctification by the Spirit and belief in the truth. To this He called you through our gospel so that you may obtain the glory of Jesus Christ. Loved ones, there's future glory. There was past salvation. There's present salvation. There's future salvation. And there's future glory as a reward. So let me put all of this together. Every present struggle you are going through right now, this is God's word to you. He'll rescue you from it. Have hope that He will rescue you from it. Every present lack in your life, because remember, salvation is not just from something, but it's to something. Every present lack in your life, God will provide for you. Every present hardship you are in right now, God will deliver you from it, and God will give you His grace for it. That is what it means to have hope. Everything I'm going through right now, God will deliver me and He will provide. But get this, in my future life, whatever I go through in the future, whatever obstacle faces me in the future, whatever comes against me in the future, hope in salvation tells me that God would both deliver me and He will give me the grace to deal with it. We need not worry, loved ones. We need not despair. Salvation is ours in Jesus Christ for the present and for the future. No matter what you experience, No matter what you are currently experiencing, no matter what lies ahead, hope tells us that salvation is ours in Jesus Christ. And I love what Psalm 30 verse 5 says, weeping, and we sing this sometimes, weeping may tarry for the night, but what comes in the morning, loved ones? Joy. Joy comes in the morning. So loved ones, if you have not yet done so, I encourage you, put your hope in Jesus Christ today. Put your hope in him. Put your hope in his salvation and his provision. And loved ones, if you have placed your faith in Jesus Christ, then keep hope alive. Keep hope alive. Your provision and your protection is assured. Keep hope alive.